Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and both of you for being here. I want to just open, and I apologize for being a few minutes late, but you know, let me just begin with a statement about all this. Human trafficking, of course, is a monstrous crime that which plagues the entire world, including, quite frankly, my home state of Florida, which is one of the top 3 destinations for human trafficking in the United States. Unfortunately, the populations of East Asia and the Pacific region are disproportionately affected by trafficking. The International Labor Organization estimates that there are currently 7.9 million victims of forced labor in the Asia-Pacific region. The recently released 2014 Trafficking in Persons report includes 4 Asian countries in the worst of the worst Tier 3 category: Malaysia, North Korea, Papua New Guinea, and Thailand. Numerous other Asian nations find themselves near Tier 3 in the Tier 2 watch list. That includes Burma, Cambodia, China, Laos, the list goes on and on. Today we'll explore, and have been exploring, the causes of human trafficking in the region, as well as the governments in that region and the responses that they've had in compliance with the laws and the expectations upon them. And the United States has always been and will continue to be a leader in combating modern-day slavery in the world, and I appreciate the work both of you do with regards to that. We must highlight this issue, hopefully, at every level when working on a bilateral and multilateral levels with countries in this important region. And I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing on this important topic, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here. I was going to start with Secretary Marcial. I wanted to ask you, how does our anti-human, and you may have answered this already, so I apologize, but how does the anti-trafficking platform, how does that work with the other priorities that we have in the region, such as defense or economic issues? How do we coordinate those sometimes competing interests, I suppose?
Thank you, Senator Rubio. Yeah, it's a very good question and a challenge for us. I mean, I guess what I would say is, in all of our relationships in the region, we obviously focus a lot on the diplomatic relationship, building people-to-people ties, trade relations, all of these sorts of things. But in every country where we see problems on human rights and/or trafficking more specifically, this is another important piece of what we do, and we make clear in our discussions with government officials that we want to build a closer relationship, but our ability to do so depends certainly to a significant extent on their willingness and ability to address these concerns, whether it's broad human rights or trafficking in persons. And then, in addition to that, in many of these countries, we'll have programs, either training prosecutors or police or judges, or often working with civil society, because civil society's role is critical in this, both exposing the problem, putting pressure on governments to do more, but then actually helping victims. So it's a combination of diplomatic pressure, making it a priority, plus specific programs, and I know Ambassador Sitabaca could talk more about that.
Senator, I think that one of the things that we're really looking at is how it works with our priorities, both around rule of law and human rights, and bringing those two together. I think that often human trafficking has been seen especially in Southeast Asia, as a transnational problem of moving people. And one of the things that I think that we've seen often, because just to get into the weeds, it's the same reporting officers in our embassies that are doing the human rights report as well as the trafficking report. It brings a little bit of a harder edge to the human rights approach, and it brings a little human rights to the law enforcement approach. And I think that that's enabled us to have a conversation that's moving into each of these countries. We're starting to be able to deal with the Thai person who's enslaved in Thailand, the Vietnamese person enslaved in Vietnam, whereas 5 years ago I think a lot of the countries were only focused upon the cross-border. What that's doing is it's allowing us to introduce other aspects of rule of law, whether it's the corruption issue, whether it's general judicial training, access to justice, etc. And I think that kind of lifts all boats, that rising tide. So we're trying to make sure that it's incorporated in that way.
Let me ask you this. I've gotten a number of NGOs have expressed concern that during the Trafficking in Persons report, the regional bureaus include political considerations in the tier rankings and press the tip office to not downgrade certain countries. Is that accurate? Is that happening? Whoever has the answer. Yeah.
Senator, actually, Ambassador Sitabaca and I sat down on a number of occasions after our teams had worked through these to go through the countries. There were, some countries that we all agreed clearly fell into one category and others, and there were others that were a little bit closer. Was it a strong B or a weak A minus, as Ambassador Sita said? And basically, we went through and discussed. I wouldn't say debated, but just discussed what the countries had done and what they hadn't done. And our conversations were all about what had been done on trafficking. So we weren't saying, no, but they didn't do anything on trafficking, but they're good friends. You can't downgrade them. We did not have that conversation. It was purely
the political considerations are not used in the TIP process to distort the tier rankings.
I think actually we collectively, the State Department, do a pretty good job of keeping this focused on trafficking, and it helps that there's real criteria, so you can't really fudge it in that sense.
Because you know what I'm getting. I mean, some people are concerned, and I'm glad to hear your statement here today. It's important to have that on the record, that in fact there are some countries where, because of certain geopolitical issues, there might be some internal pressure not to downgrade them or to move them off their current tier ranking. But your statement here today is that because of the criteria that's in place, that is not happening.
That's correct, Senator. And I think if you look at the fact that longtime friend and treaty ally Thailand was downgraded, as well as Malaysia, where the president had just visited and have a very good relationship. They were both downgraded.
Okay, and Ambassador, let me ask this question about China. And again, I apologize. You may have answered this already before. In the 2013 report, China was automatically downgraded to the lowest level of Tier 3 because it had been on the Tier 2 watch list for 2 consecutive years, and by the way, waived for 2 more years, and had not made any improvements. In the 2014 report, they were upgraded back to the Tier 2 watch list. So what exactly did China do? What improvements did they make in that reporting period that allowed them to be upgraded to Tier 2?
Senator, there's a few things that we were really looking at last year, especially the re-education through labor camps, the state-sponsored forced labor that we saw in China. And that was one of our biggest recommendations for the Chinese, and we saw movement from them this last year.
I'm sorry to interject. Is that actually happening, or are they running that program under a different name? I mean, is there real evidence that they've dismantled those programs?
We've seen evidence that they've dismantled the main program, but we are concerned that it not be shunted over to other re-education camps, whether it's drugs or other morality offenses or things like that. And it's something that we're very much looking at very closely, because I think we share the skepticism to make sure that this is a trust but verify.
Okay.
On the other hand, we see other things that they have done, such as acceding to the Palermo Protocol, the issuance of a new 5-year plan that directly went to some of the issues that we had raised. Their previous structure did not allow for the identification of male victims at all. So they were having cases where men would be brought out of mentally retarded or drug-addicted men brought out of a brick kiln where they'd been held for 5 years, kidnapped off the street, and they weren't charging that as trafficking because their definitions, their laws, just didn't see those men as trafficking victims because they weren't women being taken across an international border. They've changed that now. They've changed the structures so that you're bringing in the All China Women's Federation to do victim protection at the beginning of the cases. All of those, we think, are enough of a change that we did not feel that a Tier 3 was appropriate for China. We're not saying, however, that this is a feel-good story. This is not a Tier 2. This is certainly not a Tier 1. This is just enough to come off of Tier 3, and we're going to be really looking at this.
Let me just highlight one more thing that I'm hearing from NGOs with regards to China, and that's that many students from Chinese vocational schools are being forced to work in factories as interns, performing work that's not related to their major and, quite frankly, has no educational benefit. These students risk not receiving their diploma if they refuse to work. Is that something that we are looking at and taking into account, that they are using these sorts of forced labor situations hidden and disguised as some sort of vocational training program?
We haven't seen it necessarily rise to the level of abuse that we've expressed concern about in the Japanese training and technical internship program, or in the Uzbek use of the students for the cotton harvest and others. But it is something that we're looking at and something that we continue to keep an eye on. Again, we don't want there to be ways to try to get around getting rid of the RTL camps by coming up with other forced labor situations.
Is that okay? In your testimony, you noted that foreign governments tend to focus, and I think this was you, yes, Ambassador, it was you that said this in your testimony, that foreign governments, and you alluded to it a second ago, they tend to focus their anti-trafficking efforts on sex trafficking, which is horrifying, but there's also the issue of labor trafficking that has not, sometimes people don't think about that as equally horrifying in many cases. So how are we engaging with foreign governments? And you started to touch upon that a moment ago. Can you describe how we engage with foreign governments to explain that they are, because that's where I think you're running into a lot of the situations you just outlined a moment ago. What are we doing to kind of create more awareness on their part that labor trafficking is also trafficking, that sex trafficking is horrifying, we want to put a stop to it, but also the labor trafficking element of it as well?
I think this is actually one of the biggest issues, that the cultural change that we're moving into with these governments. A lot of folks in Southeast Asia have had a real learning curve, especially around the domestic servant issues, whether it's in Singapore, Hong Kong, other places, Malaysia, where there's such a strong culture of bringing in foreign domestic servants. Those cases often, when they manifest, to the degree that they're ever dealt with, get dealt with as assault cases. And so we've been going in almost on a case-by-case basis and doing the legal arguments with these governments to say, no, this case under international law is a trafficking case. What we've also been doing, frankly, is to then harness the anti-trafficking community in the United States so that we end up getting experts, whether it's folks from the Freedom Network or other consortia of the people who are doing the hard work, and we send them out to the countries. Some of the folks from the Florida Coalition, for instance, have been able to travel in that way. And I think that what it's doing is it's starting to get to the prosecutors and the police. I think the next step is going to be the judges. The judges don't still seem to understand this, but we're kind of lining them up and knocking them down one by one. The Thailand downgrade, I think, will speak volumes in the region because we made it very clear in the narrative that there had been work done over the last year against human trafficking. It just had been almost exclusively done in the sex industry. And while we want that, and while we laud the people who are doing that in Thailand, the crushing numbers actually show up in forced labor. And the fact that we were willing to downgrade such an important country, largely over labor trafficking, hopefully sends that signal.
I just have a brief comment and a quick question. Or did you need, no, just to come on, one more point. You just spoke about the Thailand thing a moment ago. Just here domestically, I think one of the most important things we need to continue to do, and this is more of an editorial statement, is we need to make it very clear there's nothing culturally acceptable about going to these other countries as Americans and participating in these sorts of things. I mean, there's this attitude that I've run into now and then where things we would never do in this country is okay if we do it somewhere else because in those countries it's culturally or acceptable in some way. And I think you've seen this reflected sometimes in popular culture, but even anecdotally among people. And I think one of the things we have to be very clear in that there is nothing acceptable about us or Americans going abroad to one of these countries and going into brothels at all, not to mention those that have people underage working there. And I think that's important to point out because we do find the presence of Westerners and Americans frequenting some of these places that we've talked about in the sex trafficking industry, and we should truly try to stigmatize that in our society. The last question I had, this is for you, Mr. Secretary. As the United States considers increased military engagement with Burma, how is the issue of child soldiers factoring into those conversations, and will that be a priority for us moving forward as we have those conversations on increasing that military relationship?
Senator, yes, very much so. We've had, there's a lot that we want the Burmese military to do as part of the country's broader reform effort, and we have highlighted to them the issue of child soldiers as well as use of forced labor. We've seen some movement. I think there were a couple hundred child soldiers who were released, and a willingness to talk about it. A lot more that needs to be done. Our Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, Tom Malinowski, along with our Deputy PACOM Commander, General Crutchfield, were in Burma a couple weeks ago, met with the military and talked about a range of human rights issues, including this. So we've made it very clear this is hugely important, and we'll continue to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Misra, I wanted to ask you about labor recruiters. You touched upon that in your statement earlier. They often, promise victims these lucrative jobs, and then they force them to work in either forced labor or prostitution. So if you could elaborate a little bit more on the type of prevention programs that exist in some of these countries that prevent people from falling into these false promises. In essence, what I'm looking for is examples of programs that are actually working or are successful at making headway and making people less vulnerable to these recruiters.
Thank you, Senator Rubio. And actually, one of the things that we're looking for also is good practices in this area that's very difficult to find in the labor recruitment process. A few things that we have seen that have worked, first of all, is the elimination completely of recruitment fees. Anytime that a country allows recruitment fees, it ends up being abused and people end up in situations of debt bondage. So really the first thing is to promote no fees. And we've seen that in certain sectors. We have not seen it across the board in any of the countries in East Asia, elimination of recruitment fees, but we have seen it in certain sections or for when certain employers mandate it and then the recruiters that recruit for them do that. I will say this is one of the areas why I mentioned earlier that we would like to see the U.S. government take a lead on this. Already, Congress and the President, through the NDAA and executive order last year, have eliminated fees and regulated labor recruiters further for government procurement processes. And then, as I mentioned, I can't say thank you enough to you about this, but in S744, subtitle F removes those recruitment fees. And we think that that's going to set a great precedent for the rest of the world that we'll be able to use. The last thing that I'll just say on this is the ILO just negotiated this past June a new supplement to the 1930 Forced Labor Instrument Protocol, and as part of it, and I was part of these negotiations, it calls for the elimination of recruitment fees and the regulation of labor recruiters.
And I wanted to ask you also, because you touched upon this a little bit, what are the industries, and actually so did the chairman earlier when he talked about some of these consumer products that in the U.S. are being bought or consumed that are, in some cases, potentially done through forced labor or child labor. What are the industries that are the most dependent on trafficked labor in Asia?
So seafood processing would be high on the list. The second one I would say is ready-made garments. We've seen a lot of issues of forced labor, debt bondage in the ready-made garment industry in terms of what's exported to the United States. Regionally, there's a lot of issues with construction and domestic work, but I would say in terms of products that come into the United States, it's really ready-made garments and seafood.
And Mr. Eves, in your testimony, you list several factors that can prevent child trafficking. High literacy rates, birth registration. Can you, let me ask you real quick, if you could just describe a little bit more in detail how these factors prevent children from entering the trafficking cycle.
Absolutely. I'll give an example from a program that we have in the Philippines that is similar to the one we have in Cambodia, where we have a high number of children who are forced to work in the sugarcane industry and then also in the fishing industry and as forced domestic servants. What we do is we identify children who are working, find out the circumstances of them being in that position, and then we work with their families and with the employer to get them out of that situation and back into school. But that only does so much, because oftentimes they're there because their parents aren't making enough income to be able to support their family, and so they pull their kids out of school, will give them to a labor recruiter, or let them work for very cheap because just some money is better than none. And so what we'll then do is work with those families to do everything from working so they can have backyard gardens and communal gardens so they can sell food for more money. They receive training on how to start a business, how to run a business, kind of business 101. Make sure that they can have access to safe lines of credit so that they're not taking out debts and placing their family in debt bondage. So you're looking at all the different areas that can force a family into a situation where they find themselves handing over a child or themselves to someone who does not want to do the right thing by that child. And so we've seen, in the Philippine example, we've seen over 70,000 children removed from hazardous and exploitative child labor and not go back in as a result of their family having the income and the kids having access to an education and a community that has become empowered to stand up and chase people away who are trying to recruit kids.
You touched upon the Philippines. I wanted to follow up because I know the organization, the World Vision, is involved there in the relief efforts in the aftermath of the huge storm that they had. I was concerned, and I visited there earlier this year, about the impact that anytime we've seen in the past, like in earthquakes in Haiti, that there have been massive displacements. The signal goes off in my mind and the mind of many that this creates increased vulnerability for children to be trafficked, and even adults for that matter. What has been, in your view, perhaps you may not be familiar with it, but perhaps you are, if you could share with us, if you do have this information, what has been the aftermath of the storm? Have we seen an increase in vulnerability and or trafficking as a result of it? Have the authorities there been able to do a good job of keeping that from happening?
Actually, I was just in the Philippines last month in the typhoon-affected areas, and so one of the things that we've done is USAID has provided funding to start a project looking at preventing and responding to vulnerability to trafficking. And the way they're doing it is through their larger counter-trafficking in persons policy, which they launched last year, which calls for an integration of not only addressing human trafficking, but looking at other issues as well, integrating a kind of a trafficking focus into other sectors. In this case, it's livelihoods, or helping people earn a living again. And so we are implementing a project in Ormoc province, which was one of the most heavily damaged, and where we've seen most of the children have not been able to return to school. There's high levels of vulnerability. People's entire crops and livelihoods have been wiped out. And so we know of cases where children have been trafficked, and adults in particular are incredibly susceptible to labor recruiters under the circumstances that Neha was talking about. And so as part of this project, we're working with these families to be able to earn an income so that they can protect themselves, while at the same time educating them on the dangers of labor recruiters and risky migration practices, and trying to keep them in their home communities so where they can try to get their lives back on track and rebuild after the storm. But that's an example of how the U.S. government can engage from multiple angles to prevent vulnerability to trafficking while also improving people's income and safety at the same time.